I'm Jillian Hadfield. Very pleased to welcome you back to the second day of Absolutely Interdisciplinary. I'm the inaugural Schwartz Reisman Chair in Technology and Society and a Professor of Law and Strategic Management at the University of Toronto, as well as a Canada CFAR AI Chair at the Vector Institute and a Schmidt AI 2050 Fellow. That's a long list. Most importantly, I think I was the inaugural director until the end of 2023 of this very fine institute. And I just want to reiterate for those of you who weren't here to hear me say so yesterday, just heartwarming beyond belief to see us in this fabulous building, to see this amazing community, and to know that we've set something on a path that I think that's quite durable, that'll make a difference in the world. So I want to, on behalf of Schwartz Reisman, I want to thank everyone on behalf of everyone here who's worked so hard to organize the conference. Thanks for being here today to explore our new ideas and connections. So for those of you who weren't here for yesterday or maybe need a refresher, we had lots of fantastic discussions stimulating our thinking about new challenges and questions we face in the next chapter of AI research. My ambition for Absolutely Interdisciplinary from the start was always to say, I really hope we're going to say things nobody's heard before. And I think we need a lot of new ideas. So that's what you should be listening for. What have I heard that I haven't heard before at our conferences? I had the great pleasure yesterday of speaking with philosopher Peter Railton about the ethics of artificial agents, and a conversation that we had about what a future in which humans and AI agents regularly interact might look like. We also heard from the amazing Roger Gross, whose ideas about systematizing AI safety levels will be incredibly useful as we aim to better understand and mitigate risks posed by advancing AI systems. These are questions I know Roger cares deeply about. He's been engaging with us at Schwartz Reisman for a number of years on them, and he's making a real difference in the world. So I'm so excited that he was able to talk to you. And then in our last session yesterday, our research lead, Schwartz Reisman research lead, Anna Sue, moderated a terrific panel, really fascinating, with bioethics and law expert Glenn Cohen and research scientist and designer Huili Chen, exploring the question of how to design social and technical systems to support human and machine coexistence and collaboration. And one of the reasons we schedule our sessions for nice, hefty chunks is both so we have a little room to delay our start if we need to for reasons, but to make sure that we have lots and lots of time for discussion with you in the audience, because that's the purpose of the conference, is to not have you just sit and passively receive stuff, but really engage with it, meet new people, and engage in the conversation. So please be sure to be thinking about that as we move forward. I know today will be just as exciting and stimulating as yesterday, and I'm looking forward to that. We're expanding the question of what it means to build aligned AI systems outward to discuss the social, political, and economic impacts of AI from around the world to here at home. As some of you speakers mentioned yesterday, including me just now, I want to just again call your attention to this amazing, beautiful new building, the Schwartz Reisman Innovation Campus, which has been designed and built as a flagship destination for innovative thinking, creating, and troubleshooting in the core of Canada's largest and most multicultural city, something of which we're all very proud. And we really owe it to the generosity of our donors that we have such an inspiring place to do the work. And I think you can feel it in the room. It really makes a difference. Okay, so with that, we're going to get started on the first session entitled Navigating the AI Landscape. And I'd like to welcome Kelly Lyons, who is this morning's moderator, to introduce our two speakers. I'm going to first introduce Kelly. We'll invite everybody up to the stage, and Kelly will do those introductions. Kelly is the interim director at the Schwartz Reisman Institute and a professor in the Faculty of Information in the Department of Computer Science here at the University of Toronto. Prior to joining U of T, Kelly was the program director of the IBM Toronto Lab Center for Advanced Studies, and her research interests include service science, knowledge mobilization, data science, and software engineering. Kelly is the recipient of numerous grants, including an NSERC Strategic Partnership Grant, NSERC Discovery Grant, NSERC Collaborative Research and Development Grant, 2 NSERC Engage grants, several MyTax Accelerate grants, and a SHERC Knowledge Synthesis grant. For those of you who are not Canadians in the research domain, those are all of our major granting agencies in Canada. She's also an IBM Faculty Fellow and a board member of CS CAN, Canada's leading organization for the discipline of computer science. So with that, Kelly, I'll welcome you to the stage along with Ray Perrault and Peter Loewen.
Just sit. Thank you. Thanks, Jillian. I'm already mic'd. I can talk. Don't go to the bathroom, though. So thank you again, Jillian. That was really a nice introduction. I'm really excited to be moderating this session. We have 2 amazing speakers with us. As a computer scientist by training, I've actually engaged with many questions that are deeply human in nature. I also, as Jillian said, I've done work in service science, service systems, knowledge mobilization, and as such, I've engaged in many different types of systems, human, organizational, and technological, and it's with that lens and that perspective that I'm really excited about the panel that we have organized for you today. First, I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers, Ray and Peter, and then I'm going to invite them up to give a presentation about the indices of which they're leading, and then we'll have a conversation and open it up for discussion. So let me first introduce Ray. Ray Perrault is a distinguished computer scientist in SRI International's Artificial Intelligence Center. So I have to clarify that this SRI is not to be confused with the Schwartz Reisman Institute. Ray's SRI was founded as the Stanford Research Institute in 1946, so it clearly was before this one, by several decades. Although it has been independent from Stanford since 1970, it just simply goes by SRI. So we have 2 SRIs represented here today. So maybe that's something that you haven't heard before, as Jillian was asking for you to look out for those, tidbits. Ray was the director of SRI for 30 years and is currently co-chair of the AI Index Steering Committee at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence HAI. His research interests are in natural language processing and speech act theory. He was co-principal investigator of the CALO project to build an intelligent office assistant that learns through interaction. Several technologies were developed on that project, including Siri. Ray is a fellow of a number of professional associations, including the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. He has been president of the International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence, from which he received a Distinguished Service Award. He also served as co-editor of the Artificial Intelligence Journal and is chair of the board of trustees of the International Computer Science Institute at UC Berkeley. Ray was also at one point a faculty member here at the University of Toronto in the Department of Computer Science. So it's great to have you. Welcome home, so to speak, right? Our second presenter today is Peter Loewen. Peter is the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the Robert Vipon Distinguished Professor in Democracy in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Toronto. He is also the director of the Policy, Elections, and Representation Lab, which goes by the acronym Perrault, as well as an associate director here at the Schwartz Reisman Institute, a senior fellow at Massey College, and a fellow with the Public Policy Forum. Peter's research focuses on how politicians can make better decisions, how citizens can make better choices, and how governments can address the disruption of technology and harness its opportunities. Peter's work has been published in many journals, including Nature Medicine and the American Political Science Review. He has edited 4 books and is a regular contributor to media such as the New York Times and the Globe and Mail. His most recent project, which we're going to hear about today, is the Global Public Opinion on AI Survey. So what we'll do is we'll have Ray first present on the AI Index report, and then Peter on the Global Public Opinion on AI report. So take it away, Ray.
Thank you, Kelly. It's great to be back in Toronto. I don't do this enough, but it's been a wonderful visit so far. My objective here is to expose you to the AI Index project and to quickly go over some of the highlights of the 2024 report that was released a few weeks ago. Kelly also asked me to talk about the impact of the report, which is something I have never done before in public. So I'm going to do that at the end. Before I do that, though, I would like to probe the audience and ask you, see how many of you had heard of the report or looked at some report before 2024, heard about it before you saw the title of this talk. Okay, so quite a number. Thank you. Very helpful. This report is the 7th edition. It tracks, collates, distills, and visualizes data related to AI. Our mission is to provide unbiased, rigorously vetted, broadly sourced data in order for policymakers, researchers, executives, journalists, and the general public to develop a more thoroughly nuanced understanding of the complex field of AI. Our ideal data is quantitative, current, and shows development over time and geography. The project was launched in 2016 as an offshoot of the 100-year study of AI funded by a grant to Stanford that produces a report every 5 years. And so the idea was to do something in between the years of the report. And my colleague and friend here, Sheila McElraith, has been involved with the AI 100 study for several years, and you can ask her more about that. The AI Index is managed by a steering committee that Jack Clark and I co-chair. The committee has members from all the areas that we report on, including economics, ethics, business, policy, as well as the technical areas. The heavy lifting for the report is done by 2 full-time staff members hired by Stanford, Nestor Majle and Loredana Fattarini. We also have increasingly been able to use services of researchers, both graduate and undergraduate at Stanford, to work on some parts of it. Most of the report is collaborative, but increasingly contains studies done for the index at Stanford. And in the public opinion chapter, we report on the global public opinion report that Peter will talk about later and which I will therefore stay away from. The steering committee and the staff, we agree as to which sources to be targeted every year. Every steering committee member is responsible for 1 or 2 chapters. The co-directors read and edit everything. And we get a fair amount of help from the HAI communications people for editing and dissemination. And we have 25 or 30 major sources, many of whom we've been working with for essentially since the beginning of the report. We add a few of these every year. So this is an outline of the contents of the 2024 report. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it gives you some idea of the breadth of the content of the report. I'm just going to pick and choose some aspects that I find particularly interesting, and if I'm successful, you will go and read a few at least of the 502 pages that currently make up the current report. Our first report was 60 pages. We are now substantially larger. I'm not bragging about this, and I would like it to be shorter. But I will use as an excuse that we just didn't have time to cut it back. The report gets written kind of in the fall and the spring, and lots of decisions have to be made. So anyway, and any suggestions you have about bits that we should drop, I would also appreciate. Okay, let me start with going over some of the results from the 2024 report, starting with some of the technical performance benchmarks. All the data from the report is available online, so you can go and pick it if you want. So as obviously everybody is aware of, there's been huge progress in AI, particularly in generative AI, over the last few years. This is a bunch of snapshots from Mid-Journey taken over the course of a year and a half or 2 years of their releases. The progress from the beginning to the end is simply astounding. This is the first and the last. Frankly, if these were artworks that I had to buy, I'd buy the first one, not the last one. It kind of looks like a Lucian Freud, but anyway, that's... Now, one of the major tasks of the report is to identify what benchmarks we report on. Most of the content of the report of the technical part of the report comes from benchmarks. The history of these is that benchmarks get proposed. In a few years, the systems surpass the ability of humans on the benchmark. The classic one of these is ImageNet on object recognition in images. So every year we drop some benchmarks and we add some new ones. So it is still the case, in spite of progress, that AI trails humans on some of the more complex tasks like competition-level mathematics, visual common sense reasoning, and planning. In 2023, AI had surpassed many of these, and as I say, you will be able to check these out in the report. This is a list of some of the benchmarks covered in the report, and when we added them, most of them were added this year. Benchmarks just keep happening. So one of the recent ones is the massive multimodal understanding and reasoning benchmark. So this is to test the fact that whereas models initially worked in one modality, now they work in several, in particularly in language and imagery. And so this benchmark tests not only the combination of the modalities, but their application in a range of areas. All the questions are multiple choice. That's how it's tested. And the human performance on this benchmark is in the low 80%. So this is a very difficult set of questions. And the performance of the best AI systems now is in the low 60s. So this may last another year or two. A new, different kind of benchmark tests coding ability. The human eval benchmark consists of 164 challenging handwritten programming problems. GPT-4 scores 96% on this, up from 30% 2 years ago. There's a more difficult benchmark called the SWE bench, which has tests that come from sourced from GitHub, and scores there are still below 5%, although I saw in my Twitter feed today that there is yet another one that's now, I think, up to 15 or 20, so something's happening on that side as well. Planning problems, in the way AI considers the problem, are in principle NP-complete, and current LLMs still do badly on them, though they're better at verifying plans than in constructing them. So there's a new benchmark called PlanBench, which takes problems out of the from the international planning competition, and this shows that in tasks related to this, like plan generation, the best models now still only score in the 30%. As people are become more and more aware of certain features of these new systems, new kinds of questions come up. So LLMs are known to take liberties with facts. So truthful QA is a benchmark that tries to, that tests the ability of these systems to generate true answers. It's made up of 800 questions across 38 categories. Many of these questions are crafted to challenge commonly held misconceptions, which typically lead humans to answer incorrectly. One of the interesting things about these is that the larger models tend to be less truthful. They're more set in their ways, I guess, about the facts. And if they get it wrong, then they stick to getting it wrong. But GPT-4, as of early 2024, now achieves the highest performance on this benchmark. HAL-U-Eval is another one of these benchmarks to test hallucinations. Creating AI agents that are capable of autonomous operation in specific environments has long challenged computer scientists, but emerging research suggests that the performance of autonomous AI agents is improving. So Agent Bench is a new benchmark designed for evaluating LLMs in these interactive situations over a broad range of tasks, and it's been tested on many of the current large systems. GPT-4 is the bar on the right here, which is currently the system doing the best in this area. The rise of capable LLMs has made it increasingly important to understand which models are preferred by the general public. And so launched in 2023, the Chatbot Arena leaderboard is one of the first comprehensive evaluations of public LLM preference. A human subject is presented with the answers to the same question from two randomly chosen LLMs, and then says, I prefer this one over that one, and what you get out of it is an ELO score, like in chess. Again, here GPT-4 is doing better than other current systems. Many papers have argued that LLMs exhibit emergent abilities, meaning that they can unpredictably and suddenly display new capabilities at larger scales. Perceived new capabilities are often a reflection of the benchmarks used, especially with discontinuous metrics like multiple choice. So Big Bench, which is one of the Stanford benchmarks, however, showed that only 5 of its 9 benchmarks show emergent abilities, and this is obviously critical for AI safety and alignment research. One other bit, the questions have been asked about whether LLMs can be used to correct their own flaws, and DeepMind and the University of Illinois have tested GPT-4 on 3 difficult reasoning benchmarks in mathematics, common sense reasoning, and document reasoning, and they found that when the model was left to decide on self-correction without guidance, its performance declined across all the benchmarks. So hoping that LLMs are going to be able to improve their behavior by correcting themselves is probably not a good idea. As is well known, unusual prompts may reveal data. This is a question that we talked about a bit at the session yesterday. there are ways of extracting both language data and images out of existing data, and we report a bit on that in there. We have a whole new chapter on the application of AI to science and medicine. I won't go through these results here in any detail, but they're in the areas of material science, and of biology. And one bit here that we also report on is the number of AI medical devices approved by the FDA. I actually didn't know that there were many of those, but there's actually quite a number, and the number is growing every year. Okay, moving on to investment in AI. The picture here is mixed and interesting. Global corporate investment in AI has been decreasing since 2021. And it's not just AI, this is global corporate investment, period, has been shrinking. And private investment has been shrinking as well. However, investment in generative AI has been dramatically increasing, but it's only about 25% of the total private investment. So this is the part that everybody talks about, but I think it's useful to have it in context. The number of new companies being funded is picking up. Geographically, the U.S. dominates private investment by a large amount. Number 2 is China. And then you get a bunch of European countries at the rate of about half of what the Chinese investment is. Most of the focus areas that we looked at saw declining investments last year, but some of the areas that saw growth since 2022 include AI infrastructure. That's not surprising. Generative AI is tremendously infrastructure heavy, and so everybody has to invest in infrastructure to support it, but also investments in medical and healthcare are increasing as well. In terms of supporting investment, patents are of interest. China by far dominates the number of patents issued by their national patent offices, and this has been the case for now several years. When you look at the patent data from on a per capita basis, the picture is somewhat different. South Korea is very active in that score, and Luxembourg, and then the United States. So it's interesting to see which small countries punch well above their weight. One manifestation of the interest in AI is the mentions of AI in earnings calls of Fortune 500 companies, and these numbers have gone up quite significantly over the last year. This is one of the charts that I find most intriguing and have for some time. It's from a McKinsey report that reports on the number of organizations they survey, which is several thousand, that now use AI, including generative AI, in at least one business unit or function. And this percentage is now in the 50s. It went up dramatically from 2017 to 2019. But in spite of what everybody talks about, the percentage has been relatively flat since then. It goes up and down a bit, but it's been relatively flat since then, which indicates that maybe companies are trying things and then they stop using it and they try something else. So there seems to be a fair amount of churn in in where the applications are. McKinsey reports that AI both decreases costs and increases revenues in the companies that they survey. The companies where their respondents most frequently report cost savings are in manufacturing, service operations, and risk. And for revenue gains, the functions that benefit the most are manufacturing, marketing and sales, and risk. Customer contact seems to be the currently leading application, and that again is not too surprising just from personal experience. Every time you try to connect online to somebody, to some organization, you're likely to have a chatbot thrown in your face, so somebody thinks that this is going to help. Gen AI is primarily being applied to document management, and this is one of the main applications in law firms, for example. We report on several studies about what users of AI think the AI is doing for them, and in particular, there is evidence that it makes workers more productive and leads to higher quality work. And I'm not going to go through these studies in detail. I'll refer you to the report for that. This is a Harvard Business School study with consultants that shows that their productivity increased on a bunch of tasks by 12%, speed by 25%, and quality by 40%. I will skip this one. Programmers are a class that one talks about a fair amount, and there have been some surveys of how well they do. They claim 20 to 30% improvement in productivity and speed, but 27% of programmers somewhat or highly distrust the results that they are getting from Copilot-like systems. McKinsey asked their respondents what they thought was going to happen to jobs. Although a large proportion of their respondents, about 30%, expected little to no change in the number of their employees. 43% felt that staff size would decrease, and only 15% felt that generative AI would lead to an increase in their number of employees. Okay. The relationship between industry and academia is a topic of interest to at least, I think, some people in this room. Industry continues to dominate the creation of new AI models. In 2023, industry produced 51 significant machine learning models, and academia contributed only 15. And there were also 21 models that resulted from collaborations between industry and academia, which is a new high. In terms of which companies, Google this is over since 2019. Google has produced about twice as many of these models as anyone else, then followed by OpenAI, Meta, Microsoft, and the major university in there is Tsinghua in China. Frontier models are getting more expensive. We've been working with Epoch AI to estimate the cost of training these models. There was a gentleman here who asked me yesterday where this data came from. There he is. And I would suggest there's some detail on this in the appendix in the report, and it points to the Epoch AI page where they talk about how they do this. And there are clearly estimations in places because the amount of revealed data that is necessary to produce these numbers is incomplete, to say the least. But these models are now costing, the biggest ones are now costing well over $100 million a year. The claim is that the biggest Gemini model is getting close to $200 million for training. Open models and closed models. Most of the models coming from industry are closed. That is, they are not made generally available to the public. You can use it, but you can't poke into it, and you can't build your own necessarily on top of it. However, the number of open models being created is growing. There is still construction of new models. In 2023, 65% of the new models were open source. However, closed models outperform open ones. You can get more open ones, but the really good ones are still closed, and this is an examination of the performance of a class of both open and closed ones, showing how much better the closed models are, and the bar on the right is Agent Bench, which, as we saw, tests agentic models, and on those, closed models do way better. Large models tend to have heavier environmental footprints, and there's more in there. And one of the things that is of increasing interest now is the footprint of the inference part, not the training part, but the inference part. When all of you are using this on a day-to-day basis, it adds up. Okay. AI developers are low on transparency of their models. There's a Stanford, Princeton, MIT benchmark on what it is that model creators reveal, which is quite interesting. In terms of new PhDs, in North America, they continue to go to industry over academia. The number of new PhDs in AI produced continues to grow, but more and more of them go to industry. And one of the more depressing parts of all this is the proportion of new women PhDs has been flat forever. And small changes, but it's not really making much difference. We have some new data about new PhD creation in Europe, which shows that there's considerable variation among them. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these because I'm running out of time, but let me go to policy making. No, I'm just, I want to be respectful here. Policymakers are heavily involved in all of this, and the number of reports being produced on the policy side continues to increase. As we all know, the US and the European Union, at least, have been advancing new regulations. In the US, policymaker attention, again, has gone up dramatically in 2023, and also both at the federal level and at the state level. The one interesting bit about the regulation, at least in the US, is how broadly distributed it is across regulatory agencies. There must be 30 regulatory agencies involved here, and everybody's is being affected by AI. Regulations which initially were more about expanding the use of AI are increasingly turning into constraining the use of AI. That's what the pink part of the bar here is. People across the globe are obviously becoming more cognizant of AI, but they're also becoming more nervous about what the impact is going to be. And this nervousness depends on social class, on income, and there's much more on that in the report itself. Now, so that's what I'm going to say about the content of the report. And now I'm going to address the question Kelly asked me to report, which is, does putting this kind of information out there matter? So this is the first index of the AI index. And one of the things we know we have is substantial citation of new reports in major newspapers, magazines, etc. And here are some quantitative bits about this. So top left is news articles published that cite the report by year. 2024 is data that I have after week 1 of the release of the report. Okay, so the report is released under embargo to the press a week or two earlier, so they're prepared to report on it the day of the release. So there's some activity then. But as you can see, the number of news articles has gone up sort of roughly exponentially since 2019. There's nothing before 2019 because we simply weren't collecting any of this data then. Page views reports on the number of views of pages related to the report on the Stanford website. Again, considerable increase. We're up to about 500,000 pages a year in 2023. And in terms of downloads, which is, if you wanted to download the whole thing, the number of downloads in 2023 was about 100,000. But I'm told that that's a number that doesn't matter a whole lot because most of it is read in a browser and people don't actually download the whole thing. There are, quite a number of mentions of the report in government reports at the level of 30 a year. And we also keep track of Google Scholar citations. I don't trust these numbers all that well. I don't know why, but Google seems to be having a hard time matching up the reports to the authors. But these are relatively small numbers, a few hundred a year. So we also have a list of private briefings given to various groups on the report by members of the steering committee, various Stanford people. And this is a list of some of the ones over the last couple of years. Meetings with congressional staffers. So I'm going to just go over the U.S. part for now, of congressional staffers in various departments. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Council of Economic Advisors, including the head, was present at the briefing, Jared Bernstein, the National Economic Council, the National Intelligence Council. So this is an open source agency that looks at data for purposes of the U.S. intelligence community. Some bigwigs you may have heard of before, Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State, Robert Gates, who was Secretary of Defense, Stephen Hadley, who's a White House official. Meetings with the UN. We've had a bunch of meetings with Canadian, both staffers and some MPs over the year, and then meetings with UN and EU representatives as well. So this is, I think, probably where the rubber hits the road the most, the most closely. and which we keep track of. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There are some things that are, also in the report, things that are not in the report, which we could talk about, and mostly I'm dying to get your suggestions. So hopefully after you've read some of it, if you have suggestions for better questions, better data sources, do let me know. Here's where you can find the report itself, aiindex.org, and I would appreciate comments. That's it.
So just one quick question to the audience while Peter gets set up. For those of you who didn't put your hand up, and when Ray asked, have you used it, have you heard of it, how many of those people now want to go and look at it? That's what I thought.
I've been in the building, in the offices upstairs, but this is the first time I've been in this spectacular room, and it's great to see it full. And just before I really follow on Ray's fantastic presentation, I just wanted to take a chance to thank Gillian Hatfield for many years of starting up and leading Schwartz Reisman Institute and doing a spectacular job, and really being at the head of a community that we've built here at U of T that has been a spectacular thing, will outlive all of us. It might become artificial at some point, but for now is very, very real, and for me has been a real source of intellectual sustenance and inspiration. So I don't know that Gillian's got a formal thank you yet, but you can never have too many, so just join me in a big round of applause for Gillian for amazing work. So what I'd like to do follows really well, I think, on what Ray has talked about. I'm a scholar of public opinion, which is to say I'm very interested in how people think about things. And often how they think about things they haven't thought about too much, or they don't know a lot about. And I'll just say that one of the animations, or one of the reasons why we want to study public opinion is because, and this is a thesis, this is a claim, it's because what people think, even when they don't know much about it, constrains what we can do. That people's beliefs about how the future should be, what's acceptable, how we should interact with each other, how we should interact with machines, all the judgments that people hold matter then for what can be done in the economy, in government, in the interface between those things. And we're at a spectacularly interesting point in the world right now where the way people are thinking about technology is changing almost as quickly as technology is changing, in which people who are making policy and trying to do something to set up a framework for how artificial intelligence will interact with everyday life are really struggling with figuring out how to do that. They're trying to figure out what the public wants, and they're trying to be responsive to that public. So in service of that, we've completed a study, which I'm going to tell you about, which really scans not the whole world, but a representative population of the world, to understand what their opinions on artificial intelligence are across a whole suite of things. Not quite as much waterfront as covered by the AI index, but actually quite a lot. And you'll see the title here is going to tell the story, and I'll give you the punchline and then I'll show it to you. But what you'll see as we go through this is that there are really two worlds in terms of how people are thinking about artificial intelligence. And Ray said something interesting. He said sort of, across the world, this is how people are thinking about it. And if you look at the set of countries that are there, it's a big set of countries, but it's not a global set. And what you're going to see is that the world that most of us inhabit, that is North America, Western Europe, where we might transact, has a very different set of views on AI across a whole number of measures than other parts of the world, especially India, China, Indonesia, Africa, to the degree that we've got a representative sample of that continent. So what I really want to show you is across a whole kind of large suite of measures, how there really are two worlds right now of public opinion that are emerging. And I'm not going to say much about it, but I think it's a great jumping off point for all of us to have a conversation about how the world's changing in terms of how people are ready for this. So to just tell you a little bit, what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study, the Global Public Opinion Study on artificial intelligence. I'm going to share with you some key insights of it, then I'm just going to put a few nuggets of discussion out there for you. So here's the deal on what we did. This is the inaugural version of what will become an annual global opinion, global survey on how people are thinking about artificial intelligence. We're actually, candidly, very inspired by the AI index, because those of you who have used it for a long time know that it changes, and it takes on new measures, and it's kind of responsive to the data that are out there and also interests that are out there. So we imagine the study not only giving us annual benchmarks for things you want to see year over year, but delving into new things as they emerge. The study is a public opinion study, and the essence of public opinion, and let's forestall some objections. The essence of public opinion is you talk to people who don't know what they're talking about to figure out what they're thinking about things they haven't thought about. Okay? This is not expert opinion. This is what the public thinks about things. Okay? We live in a world apart from the public sometimes, but we have to live with them at other times. The study's pretty remarkable in that it's got great geographic variation. So we've got a population that represents effectively the majority of the population in the world. And how do you do that with 21 countries? Well, once you get in China, India, Indonesia, the United States, Brazil, you very quickly start to cover the majority of the world. So we're not generalizing to the whole world with this opinion, but we're giving you data from countries that cover the majority of the population in the world. We did that in 21 countries, 12 different languages, and ended up with somewhere just shy of 25,000 respondents. You can see here the kind of geographic coverage that we have. We studied opinions in North America, in Europe, principally in Western Europe, but not entirely. An interesting set of countries in Asia. We got the Australians in there because, for better or for worse, they are their own continent. We've got Kenya and South Africa, and we've got the largest countries in South America. In future years, if you have a lot of money and you are dying to know what Paraguayan opinion is on AI, we're happy to talk to you, okay, and take your money. Hoping we can expand the set of countries that we have in this over time. There's a lot of topics that are covered in the study. This is sort of the thumbnail of what we cover, but we've got general attitudes towards artificial intelligence. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We have people's understanding of AI, their self-evaluated understanding, and also a little bit of testing around what AI is and isn't, and we see how well they perform on that. We have a lot on people's beliefs about the impact of AI on labor and employment. That's a whole stream of other research that my lab does a lot on. I'm happy to talk about how people are thinking about the mental models that they're applying to what they think AI is going to do in the future. It's very interesting. Some measures on regulation and trust, we'll touch on those. We do a bit on ChatGPT, on deepfakes, on self-driving cars. Some on consumer behavior, where are people willing to engage AIs in their consumer behavior. And then a whole other suite of employments of AI or applications of AI. The set that we're going to talk about here, attitudes towards AI, regulation, consumer behavior, and government use, might seem random, but you're going to see that a picture emerges from these about public opinion on artificial intelligence that's consistent across all of them. These are the key insights, so let me tell you about these, and then I'll show you some data. People feel like they understand artificial intelligence. We're not saying they do, but overall, people will tell you that they think they know what's happening here, roughly. Globally, respondents feel positive about artificial intelligence, but you'll see that there's a massive regional divergence in this. And this is the first time that you'll see these two worlds emerging. The people have very positive views on the balance. They actually have more balanced views as well, but they have more positive views on balance if you're talking to them in China, in India, in Indonesia, and in Kenya. And they're generally very, very negative if you're talking to respondents in North America and in European countries. And we'll see how much that negativity kind of runs all the way through. People think AI will have an impact. About half of respondents tell us they think that they will lose their job to a computer or a machine in the next 10 years. They believe that their children's jobs, in some epistemological sense to which a child's job exists in the future, are even more likely to be lost. There's really, really interesting differences around regulation, which we'll show you about in a moment. And there are very interesting differences, self-reported differences on ChatGPT. Let's talk about general attitudes and get into this. So this is largely the kind of thing you're going to see for the next 10, 15 minutes or so. A distribution of countries here. We're going to order them not alphabetically, but sort of on performance in most cases. And in each of these Each of these slides, you'll see that there's a global average that we express. For those of you who are interested, the global average here is not the weighted average of each country by its population. It's simply the average of the averages in each country. Okay? So it allows for inter-country comparison, but not for estimates of what the actual global opinion were to be if you were to randomly draw a person from anywhere on the globe, though we can obviously do that with our data. Okay, so let's start with the real meat of this. We asked respondents about whether they think AI development effectively should be sped up or should be slowed down. And if you look across that graph going from top to bottom, you see that there's lots of advocacy or support for speeding things up if you're at the top, and not much if you're at the bottom. And just take a read down the left-hand side and see which countries are close to the top and see which countries are close to the bottom. The story here is that preferences for the current speed or a faster pace for AI development are highest in India, Pakistan, China, Kenya, Brazil, Italy, Mexico. They're all above, South Africa are all above the global mean. And when you get way down to the bottom, who's there? Canada, Japan, Indonesia, the UK, Portugal, Australia, Poland, Germany, Spain, US, such that 3 times more respondents express optimism for, or preference for faster AI development in India than they do in Canada. We can talk a little bit about sample composition, but it's not explaining it, right? It's genuine differences in attitudes. If we ask people about excitement or concern for AI growth, on the whole, while thinking about AI, would you say you're more excited about growth in AI or more concerned? Just by show of hands in the room, how many people would choose more excited? How many would choose more concerned? Yeah, so we could have had you in our study and saved a lot of money, just done it in the room here for Canada. But the story here really is that you've got excitement about what's going on, right? And that excitement is highest in places, again, that are in the so-called global south, if you will, and it's the least high in the Anglo-American countries. If you ask for general views on AI, whether people think it's positive, fairly positive, but neutral, somewhat negative, very negative, and again, we're just trying to probe latent things, right, and latent opinions over and over again. You see the same pattern again. And you see the countries that sit below that global mean are countries which are more developed and countries in which most of us transact and go about our business. If you ask about beliefs that AI will make the future better or worse, an incredibly stark difference emerges, right? That there's an overwhelming majority of people in the global south who think AI is going to make the world better for them, going to make their world better, and it's the opposite for people who are living outside of that, of those parts of the world. Support for the development of AI, again, it's a similar type of outcome. You might say, well, these are all measuring the same thing. That's kind of the point, right? That there's a latent set of opinions on things that you might characterize as optimism. Now, we asked people about the current impacts of AI, whether they think the current impacts of AI now are going to be positive or negative on a whole bunch of different domains, where 0 is a very negative score and 10 is a very high score where the impact is most positive. And we went through a whole bunch of different outcomes. So I'll just walk you through them. But you can see that score of 5 is positive, right, on balance. So most places are positive, but the same pattern emerges that there's just more optimism about the impacts, positivity about the impacts of AI on democracy, for example, in India and in China. We can talk about what that means in China, but than there is in our parts of the world. Similarly, on inequality, the belief that AI and technology will have a positive impact on inequality, that is to say lessen it, is there in the developing world in a way that it is not in our parts of the world. On the economy, more positivity overall. You can see a rightward shift in all of the bars, but the story again is that other parts of the world are more positive than here. On you personally, and on society. If we go out 10 years and ask people in the future as though there's some sort of distinction here, it's a similar story again. And I won't spend too much time on this, but let me just move through it. And you can see the same patterns, whether we're talking about democracy, inequality, the economy, you personally, or society. AI and job loss. Here's the most, if I'm going to tell you one thing that I want you to take away from this, here's the most remarkable set of findings on this. And what you're going to see is that there's actually not a huge amount of variation about people's belief that AI is going to displace their jobs, but about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing varies a lot depending on where you are in the world. So if you ask people, how personally vulnerable do you, we ask them exactly, do you think a computer machine will replace your job within the next 10 years? The optimism And the enthusiasm about AI in the global south can't be explained by a myopic view about whether a job will be replaced, because there's more belief in that part of the world that jobs will be replaced by computers than there are here. Right? So if you look at the Canadian case, for example, you have only 36% of people who are saying that their job definitely or probably will be replaced by a computer or machine in the next 10 years. There's probably better formulations of this question. Do you believe that 40% of your job will be replaced by currently demonstrable technology? But that's not an interesting question, and it's not the way people think. But nonetheless, you've got much, much lower belief about job replacement here than you do in other parts of the world, and yet they have higher degrees of enthusiasm about technology. If you ask folks about their confidence in finding a new job, you can see that that confidence is higher in other parts of the world than it is here, right? And this explains why you can have a greater belief in the potential of job loss, but also more optimism about AI. Canada does okay on this, actually. Most Canadians think they're going to be able to find a new job extremely or somewhat easily. We'll see, I guess. Regulation and safety. One way we tried to get a sense of regulation, and this is something where Gillian will have really good thoughts to share with us, was we gave people a whole suite of different actors who can be involved in the regulation of AI. Asking them, from people like nonprofit organizations to governments to technology companies themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And we asked them to choose all the actors they think should have a role in regulating AI. And what you see is a couple of things here that are worth noting. The in no region of the world does anyone choose government in the majority as the regulator of AI. Okay, so that depends whether that's good or bad. Depends on your views about whether government should be involved in the regulation of AI or not, right? But no one is in that bottom right quadrant where they think that there should be state governance of AI only in the majority. But then there's another dimension you can think about, which is how much people think that that private companies, tech companies, should have a role in the regulation of AI. And you can see that in parts of the world like Africa and in Latin America, South Asia, compared to the EU and then Canada, the so-called Anglo countries, Canada, the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom, you can see that there's more of a belief in private governance in those parts of the world than there is here, right? So if you think that the future of AI regulation is actually going to involve multiple actors in the mix, being involved in whether collaboratively or confrontationally in coming up with regulatory schemes for AI, other parts of the world are getting there faster than we are in terms of how their populations are thinking about this. So we're in a position where we are here that we don't think anyone actually is in a good position to regulate AI. And in fact, in Canada, the none option gets the highest choice, where 1 in 5 people think that nobody should be involved in regulating AI in this country. If you can read this graph, you should work as a sniper for a military somewhere. But I'll send it on the slides afterwards, and you can see this. But the story that comes out of this is sort of the actor by actor numbers on who should be able to who should be best placed to regulate AI. If you look at trust in organizations, about how much people trust different organizations to use AI safely, where darker shades of blue are telling you that there's more trust across those organizations, you can start seeing a clustering in the gradient there, right? That as you move down to, if you move from the global south into the developed world, you can see as things are getting lighter, which is just telling you that there's less trust across all organizations in their capacity to use AI safely. Okay, I'll just say a couple things on ChatGPT, and then we'll get into chatting with Ray. And I'm going to note here with Kelly, and I'm going to note here that because this is an online sample that we've run from, surely I'm not talking for 59 more minutes. Because this is an online sample that we've run from, you can generalize this to the online population, which means different things when you're sampling people in the developing world than it does in Canada. But just leave it at that for a second. If you look at people's perceived usefulness of ChatGPT for their work, whatever job they're doing, you can see that there's a real different set of views here about whether ChatGPT and other models are going to be useful for work. You can see that people's views about the effect of this on their work, about whether it is going to be make their job easier or make their job harder, in effect of whether they're substitutors or whether it's going to be something that takes away, complements their work. There's much more of a feeling of complementarity in the developing world than there is in our part of the world. If you look at people's use of belief that ChatGPT will be good for work assistance, whether they're individuals or now or in future generations. Again, you see the patterns. By this point, you should have the sense of it. Let me just share with you briefly a few applications where people might be thinking about using AI, and to give you a sense of people's willingness to use it. Then I'll show you usages in government, and then we'll be done. This is a preference of people for a human or an AI in making a loan decision. Given the scenario where we say you walk into a bank and the final decision rests with a human or it rests with an AI as to whether you should get a loan. And dark blue, the navy blue is whether a human should make that decision, and the powder blue is whether an AI should make that decision. And what's the story that comes out of it, right? People like humans overall in most places to begin with. There's a majority preference for humans. But the willingness to engage with an AI to make a pretty important financial decision for you on your behalf is much higher in developing parts of the world. Okay, finally, we gave people scenarios where we asked them about the use of AI by government to make decisions on behalf of people. There's a certain irony that people want service from government and complain about standing in lines, that they have a hard time kind of reconciling in their heads that a human should be serving them at a desk. They shouldn't have to wait for anything, but you'll see it here in the data as well. We asked people whether they agree that or disagree that AI should be used for the following tasks. For example, determining eligibility and amounts for welfare and social security entitlements. In China, in India, in Pakistan, Indonesia, in Kenya, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, more than the global average, and indeed a majority agree that an AI should be used for this. Quite the opposite if we look in developed parts of the world. Government use of AI for assessing taxes. It's already happening, of course, right, depending on how you think about an AI, but it's already been done algorithmically for a long time by definition. But there's much more willingness for government to use this to do auditing and other functions. Government allocation of enrollment of people in welfare programs or social security programs to determine eligibility, not amounts, but eligibility. Again, huge support for it in the developing world, the opposite in the developed world. The use of government, AI by government for for auditing of funds and identifying misuse, and for detection of fraud. Overall, a lot of people like it for fraud, but detection, but much, much more in the developed world and non-compliance. So I'll just leave these thoughts here with you about what I think of as sort of the two worlds of public opinion towards artificial intelligence. This shows up over and over and over again across all of our measures, that there are two different sets of opinions on this. And it has to do with, there's a whole broader array of outcomes we have in the data, and it shows up in those as well. One of these worlds is optimistic, it's realistic, it's broad-minded about artificial intelligence. The other world is not. And I think there's a very interesting question about what world we are in and what world we want to live in terms of how we think about artificial intelligence, how enthusiastic we are about it. But we might want to ask, if we don't like the world we're in, how we get to it. So I'll just leave it at that and look very much forward to your questions and to Kelly's and to, of course, to Ray's. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you both. So much in there. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that came up for me when you were talking, and I think we'll have broad interest from the audience. And then we'll open it up because I think I'm sure there's a lot of ideas that have been sparked through this conversation so far. So my first question is, this is primarily a research community in our audience, and if you had, a pot of money and a bunch of resources, and you could deploy some of this community on a research problem that you think is extremely pressing, that you learned through these indices, through this data, could you pick one or two, or what would you recommend? Peter? Ray?
Well, so there are questions that we don't address, that the index report does not address well. And some of these have been there like forever. They're a matter of availability of data, of comparability of data across regions. Two that I'm particularly aware of. One is publications in various parts of AI and the impact of publications on various parts of AI. It turns out that is getting more and more difficult to get coherent, explainable results in this area. The first set of data about publications that we got from our publications provider had over 40% of the authors could not be attributed to a given country, to a particular country. The data just, it's just not there. And that's obviously one of the major issues. If you can't categorize publications by where they come from, there's a lot of these questions that are just irrelevant, that are difficult. The same issue happened. I was at AAAI recently, and they put up their chart of where the publications submitted to the conference were, and number 2 was do not know. Number 2 country was do not know. So there's something weird going on in here. Authors submit publications with Gmail addresses, and that's it. So that's an issue. And I don't know whether that's, how easily that's fixable, but that's definitely an issue. Related to that, also increasingly difficult, is what counts as an AI publication. And that was relatively easy 10 years ago. It's much more difficult now because, it was easy because AI researchers published mostly in a pretty well understood set of venues. But now, when so much of AI is AI plus something, you have to go looking for AI publications in biomedical journals, in legal journals, in whatever, right? And it's everywhere. And how to identify those? And presumably, you would want to be able to classify publications as kind of core AI as opposed to applications. And you'd like to be able to look at the communities of people who are involved in these. So there's a whole bunch of work that that I think would be needs to be done there. One of the good things about this area is that there are international. The publications data is international. You don't have to pull them together. They all show up in the same indices. The problem is what to do with them when you get there. Then there are problems where the international data, as far as I know, simply does not exist. And one that I'm, particularly interested in is public investment in AI. So there are some numbers, and we report on some in the report, about public investment in the US. It's, again, very difficult to tell what an AI research project is or not. And it's not the same problem as judging publications. There are government budgets, and then there are ways in which the money actually gets spent. There's the part that's spent on the development of the software, and there's the parts that's spent on the applications of the software and spent on the infrastructure that's necessary to support all of this, and how you tease all this apart. The U.S. National Security Report on AI a few years ago was recommending that roughly the same amount be invested on software as in required hardware, which I found quite striking at the time, but in retrospect, if compute is a major factor, then it matters. So that's a fact in which getting data internationally in this area, I don't know how to do it. So we'd have to first solve, how do you decide what's AI? And then how do you decide how much the German government is spending on AI, and India and so on? And that would have to be an international effort. And if anybody has a better idea, I would love to hear it. And I think that would be useful to know.
Great.
So if I had money to deploy, I would send people to work on Ray's project, because there were a couple of things that really stood out for me from it that I'd like to know the answer to. But one was, I was really really impressed by what appears to be a massive shift in investment dollars away from all sorts of applications, basically to computing power. What it looks like, in there. That's largely American money, I presume. But the political economy I know why that shift has been made, because I think it is that all of these models are now hitting up against computational limits pretty quickly, and that's obviously pushing marginal cost through the roof. But I'd really like to understand what the set of investment decisions are that are behind that, driving that, because it would be very interesting to understand whether or not this is actually, kind of chasing after scarcity in a way that is quite expensive. And then I'd like to know whether or not how China and India are thinking about the same problems in some sense. And then to your point about sort of what counts as an AI investment, it is really interesting the way, just the political economy of it, the way different sets of countries are thinking about the long-term game of setting up the infrastructure for the next generations of this in a way that are different. And China's taking very, very seriously to be engaged in standard-setting exercises, to go to places to try to the degree that there's any regulation of all of this, to try to get that regulation to align with its view of the world. We're taking it much less seriously in North America as a coordinated effort, right? So that part of it sort of jumped out at me quite a lot. And then there are these. It's a slide I wanted you to stop on, but you had so many. The differences in gender breakdown on PhDs in computer science, and the fact that there's actually big differences between countries. Some just have a higher level. It's not that 90-10 U.S. split, and some have actually started to move the curve on women in computing. And understanding why there's that variation just struck me as sociologically very, very interesting.
That's something I've been interested in since my PhD, when it was 40% women in my undergraduate class, and it's been on a downhill slope since then. Not sure how to fix that one. We've been working on it for many years. Maybe the audience has some insights. The other question I wanted to ask was, you both kind of touched on things that you really wanted to highlight or that you found intriguing, I think was one of the words Ray used. And was there something that really surprised you? Maybe we'll start with Peter, because it's a newer index. Were you surprised by this two worlds model?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I generally think in Canada we've got I'm not surprised where Canada sits, right? It's a good occasion for my favorite joke, which is, what's the first thing that a Canadian asks when they get to heaven and St. Peter's waiting for them at the pearly gates? And he says, welcome, Kelly. Do you have any questions before you enter? The first thing that a Canadian asks is, how did you get my information? And I've always thought we are really a privacy-obsessed place that I think has a conservative rather than an ambitious view of how data should be used in kind of in all parts of our lives, and that's for some reason is deeply cultural. But the degree to which that sort of showed up in all the countries that are culturally and politically and geographically proximate to us, to me was surprising, right? And some of this has to do with sample composition, who's responding a little bit, but it's not really that, right? It is that there's different attitudes here about what can happen. And if you think about the big picture, I mean, is it surprising that people in India are incredibly enthusiastic about what technology is going to do? When you think about the fact that in the last 10 years, 300 million people who didn't exist in the eyes of the state before are now digitally engaged by the state. They've got digital ID, they can actually receive payments directly from the state, where before that was stolen by someone who was farther up the chain in terms of the delivery of those services. Like, there's parts of the world where not only are there huge increases in material wealth, but the relationship of that to digitalization across a whole spectrum of things is massively implicated. So that's not surprising to me, but how stark it was all the way down the line was, I think, is pretty notable.
Right?
So maybe two things. One is the chart about adoption that I mentioned and said, I was surprised by this and I continue to be surprised by this. And then the other one kind of goes back to some of the discussion yesterday, is the performance of these current systems. I mean, it is stunning how good they are. Yes. And it is stunning how 10 years ago we just never guessed that this is the way things would turn out. Now, along with that is it's kind of the genie is out of the box, and these systems do some things amazingly well, but at least I don't understand what's going on inside, and I don't understand what it's going to take to trust them. I don't use them personally very much because most of the interactions I have with, I don't specifically go to ChatGPT for that many things because mostly I find that web searches give me more reliable results than ChatGPT does. Now, if I were to use it for brainstorming or something which is much less dependent on facts, then I think they do really quite amazing things. So we have this enormous challenge of figuring out what they're good for, what we trust them for, how we can inflect their development so that they become more trustworthy, how we will know, and that is, to me, the kind of the main axis in which I think the axis, the development of the AI index is going to have to go. And the community clearly recognizes this, right? These new benchmarks are being created to specifically probe some of these areas. And we didn't have these benchmarks a year or two ago. I mean, they're coming up because the community itself says this really matters.
Well, and as someone who was trained as a programmer and spent a chunk of my career working as a developer in a company, I think there's a big change afoot for our software development community and jobs. One of the other things, just quickly before we open it up, one of the things that's excellent about these indices, these measures, is the fact that much of the data, if not all of the data, is available for people like us to probe further. Obviously there's lots of other data available. Many governments have open data websites. Do you know, perhaps Peter, it's early for you obviously, but do you anticipate, and Ray, do you know if there are other data sources that people are using to combine with the data that's been made available through the index to glean additional insights, or if that's something that is not? You have no way to know.
I don't know of anything.
Maybe some
particular.
people here are doing something like that.
Yeah. So I'll make a kind of more general comment on this, which is it's comment about academia, right? But one of the things that's going to change a lot in the next. It's changing now, but it's going to be very different 10 years from now than it was 10 years ago, is obviously the speed at which people can collect and then disseminate data, the rapidity with which it can be done, right? And one of the challenges we're going to have within academia is figuring out the proper crediting system and citation system, but also just what the economy of this will be within universities, right? Because the model we have now is so counterproductive to knowledge, where essentially the model is if you go out and do a bunch of data collection, you bring in periods of embargo so that only you can work on those data for a period of time, often to the point that either you basically choke it in a submission and it tells you what you want, and so much time has gone by the data are no longer useful, right? Or in a way where you're not getting everything you could get out of it because you're rushing to get it out there, as opposed to putting it into the world as quickly as possible, which the index does, so other people can use it, right? So to Ray's point, the inability of the index to be caught up in Google Scholar even, for example, right, is an indication of the brokenness of that system, right? That we don't have the economy right yet in terms of crediting people for data collection and dissemination, as opposed to the downstream production of research that happens from data that other people have collected.
That is changing in some fields. I don't know if people here have experienced that, but certainly I see fairly structured way of citing data sources and giving credit to, people being rewarded and having on their CV that there were this many downloads of this artifact that they produced through their research. I think that's a trend we should see more of, because bringing more minds to these questions and looking at these data sets from different perspectives will definitely advance our knowledge, I think, as a world and a community. Let's open it up. So just a reminder, there are people running around, about to be running around with microphones. So wait, oh my goodness, many hands up. G, okay, I think the first hand I saw go up was at the back there on the farthest left. My left. Thank you.
On? Okay, sorry. So thank you very much. It was really interesting. I had a couple of quick questions. One about the AI index. I was interested in that evidence about AI models surpassing or getting close to performing as humans in several tasks. And I was wondering to what extent maybe focusing on AI, say, beating humans is perhaps taking a stance of where AI should go as opposed to looking at metrics to the extent that's possible and feasible about how AI can help and support humans. I was wondering whether you see a difference or it's just semantics. And for Peter, I had a quick question. So when we see these two words, maybe immediately we classify them in, yes, is global north versus global south, for example, and as a consequence, level of economic development, income, and one might be led to thinking, for example, that in the rich world, we have the luxury to be thinking about the concerns as opposed to focusing on the benefits. But I guess one other distinction between the North and the South, not perfect obviously, is the degree to which people care about democracy and the quality of democracy and human rights. And so, of course, it's difficult to separate the two factors, maybe determining the answers, but I was wondering if you had any thought about that. Thank you.
Ray, do you want to go first
Well,
on the benchmarks?
So, right, the benchmarks all have, I mean, primarily they're measured against perfect performance on the questions that are being asked. So, and all of them report those numbers. Some of them report numbers, do a separate test to see how well humans do on this benchmark. And that's another way of comparing benchmarks and trying to figure out whether effectively they're obsolete or not. And not all benchmarks have a human measure, but I think most of them do. Getting a human measure is complicated. I mean, on some of these that require considerable expertise, there's a range of performance of humans. So I think the main thing is you got to look at the performance of the benchmark against perfect performance to start with, and then worry about humans. Now, one thing I didn't talk about, and which I hope we will spend more time on in the coming year, is the relevance of benchmarks. And there was a very interesting paper late last year or early this year challenging some of the claims that ChatGPT did pass the uniform bar exam. And if you look at this really carefully, the claim is that no, it probably didn't, and it depends on on how the questions were scored. It depends, which seems to be a particularly tricky issue. How they do on the essay parts, how against what category of test takers they're compared. So this is not a trivial question, and I think the more of these benchmarks that are comparisons to tests that humans take as part of qualifying for a profession or something, the more these kinds of questions are going to come up. So benchmarking itself is it's a tricky art.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
I think it's a very good question. I think one way of kind of thinking about that question is to sort of ask, is this kind of, are there differences in terms of people's prioritization of the status quo versus change, in essence, right? And you can imagine kind of a model in which you say, well, if things are relatively good in a country, people value the status quo across everything, even if, and the kind of the values explanation they use for supporting the status quo might be irrelevant or orthogonal to some applications, but in other cases it applies, but it applies with equal weight. And I think that's I think that kind of formulation is a reasonable one, right? I think what makes that worrying, right, is that if that's true, the amount of space that then gives kind of public entrepreneurs, if you want to think about it in those terms, to be creative and to be ambitious about what governments do with data and how governments can use technology to serve people, for example, is constrained. And that's problematic, right? If we're in a space in which we can't get anything good going because people think that there may be violations down the line. And I think you can find thumbnail examples of that quite easily in many of these countries. So arguably, I think it's probably to our detriment. But I think it's a reasonable explanation about why you see those kind of results consistently, right? Yeah. So thanks very much for the question.
Jillian.
Can you hear Jillian in the back?
We need the mic turned on.
Okay, there we go. So I wanted to just follow up, Peter, on the governments, the role for governments, because I was having trouble interpreting the graph, and I hadn't seen it before, the plot that you had there. I saw the percentage interest in private sector and government participating in that, but then zero, as you pointed out, in the full government regulations. So I think maybe there were two questions that were or two pieces of data that were being conveyed there. So I wanted to understand that a little bit more, because it's obviously critical, and I think it's related to, Ray, the observation you're making about adoption, because I think these are questions that are happening within industry about concerns about liability. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't really have that, I like to say, like have that infrastructure that would give industry confidence when they could adopt. But anyway, maybe I could just hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the way to think about that graph, and sort of the argument that's being made from it is, if I ask people independently, actor by actor, should this actor play a role in regulating AI? Government, yes or no? Industry, yes or no? Tech companies, yes or no? And you go through all the actors. The basic story is that across most of those different actors, there's more openness to any one of those actors being involved in the regulation of AI in the developing world than there is in the developed world. So then if you think that the capacity to regulate comes from public consent, then what follows from that is that if in the developing world you've got a whole suite of actors you can draw on, you've got some public support, some public will for them to be involved in regulation, where in the Anglo-American case more, and it's quite pronounced in Canada, you're in a position where people, A, don't want anyone regulating, right? And to the degree that they're choosing a regulator, they're choosing government most often, but they don't choose it all that often, right? And that's a bad position to be in, right? Because I think, I imagine if we follow this down, your argument would be that who regulates is kind of a it depends question about the technology and about its level of sophistication and how it's being deployed and what our capacity is for different actors to monitor it and to actually act as accountability agents on that technology. And a mature response to this is really going to be, it depends, right? Who you involve to do this optimally. So it's a little bit as though, and this goes actually to the question about underlying values between these systems. It goes a bit to the belief that we tend to think of government as being the principal regulator in our mental models in the North American context, for sure. And there's not a lot of trust in government, and that's the worst of both worlds in some sense, right? Only government if necessary, but not necessarily government, but nobody else. Right? Does that make more sense?
We'll go to Hayani next and then back.
Hello? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. So question for Peter. And in terms of comparability across the respondents, I was wondering how socioeconomic status was taken into account. And that's a threshold question. But relatedly, I used to work for the World Bank and with indices. And one of the methodology challenges that we see when we try to compare across countries with very different Gini coefficients is that socioeconomic class matters very differently across each country. And so we might even get into issues, for example, where the average Canadian might express views that are more representative of Canada than, let's say, the average surveyed Brazilian. So I was wondering how these problems were taken into account.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a really serious challenge, right? So there's two things I'd say about it, and I'd love to chat about it more. But one is that, you know, in obviously in the strictest sense, the representativeness of these data, or its generalizability, is generalizable to the population the kind of population that's responding to it. And here, the survey mode matters a lot. That we are reaching people who are reachable on the internet, who are open to doing surveys. So there's clearly limitations in that. There's a whole bunch of weighting schemes we've used, benchmarked against census data, to make the data more representative. But what I would just say, and we can get into it more, but the biggest differences that you find in these data are attributable to fixed differences between the countries, rather than differences according to correlates within the country. So if you look at the effect of relative positioning of education for a respondent within the country, or relative positioning of their income within their country, and its effect on opinions, it's not all that big. Right? So the average Indian's got just higher optimism than the average Canadian, conditional upon every control you can put into a model when we do it at an individual level. So most of the explanation has to do with where people live, not who they are in the place where they live. But acknowledge that the challenges are massive in trying to get really strict comparability.
Thank you. I think Peter Railton was next, and then we can go back there again and back up.
Hi, this is a question. For Ray. You noted that the percentage of PhDs going in industry was increasing and going to academia was going down. Looking at research investment also. Do we have any idea of how that's affecting the kinds of research projects that are being done? Looking to the future, what is being studied in university research projects versus industry research projects? If you look at joint university industry projects, do they skew toward the kinds of issues that industry is most interested in? So how is it shaping what we're going to learn in the next 10 years or whatever, that this balance of research is changing? And do you see an issue there that should be addressed in some way?
Excellent question. And really important question. I don't live in a university context, so I'm not, watching my colleagues make these decisions on an ongoing basis. I do get the sense that if you're tied to AI and you're not doing research that involves LLMs, you're kind of considered to be on the boundaries. And so what a lot of researchers find themselves having to do is to decide how the big questions that they've been working on can be adapted to working in this context. But this is frankly largely speculative on my part. It's probably something that it would be worth having a survey on. I don't know how much of this one could figure out by actually looking at quantitatively at the literature to see where it goes. And then, of course, the obvious point is that most academics don't have access to the kinds of compute that's necessary to at least train systems from the bottom up. And so they're limited in what they can do to what they can do with open models, or with models that closed models from organizations with whom they have relationships. And I'm astounded at how much work can be done that way, because the total number of publications in the area is going up. The conferences are bigger than they ever were, so researchers are figuring out how to do research, how to get it published. It is happening. But there clearly are constraints, and there are movements on the part of governments to provide facilities that make more of this work possible. I must say I'm not quite sure what the situation is in Canada, but in the US there's this national AI research facility where money will be made available to pay for computation. But these projects are expensive. I mean, my son, who's kind of connected to, who's in this area, was writing a research proposal, and he said the amount of compute we are going to need in the first year or two is going to be roughly what it would have cost to pay a graduate student. So, that forces, if you're going to do it, that forces a shift.
There were a bunch of hands at the back, so maybe we could just move back there again and then come back up to the front. We can wrestle for the...
Hi. William? Yeah. Peter, Kelly, and Ray, thanks so much for the presentation so far. It's been fascinating. I come from the UK, which on the slide that Peter showed is similarly hesitant, I should say, I guess, when it comes to the adoption of AI. I now work cross industry and research, and in a lot of the practice I do, I see fears and nervousness around the use of AI in commercial practices. There's also simultaneously a mention by the Bank of Canada that there's an emergency in productivity here in Canada, to use their language. I'm not a techno-optimist, but I do see benefits from some of these technologies in terms of improving productivity. So my question is, how do we address this hesitation and this fear when it comes to AI in organizations and in work? Does it come through education? Does it come through more regulation? Does it come through just simple time and getting used to seeing these technologies more frequently?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer to it is actually, right? I mean, the standard dodge that people make on this stuff, right? In the big pictures, they say, like every big industrial revolution has created more jobs in the end than it created at the start, kind of ignoring, how much septic tank there is, between you and the greener grass, right? So I think there's a lot of disruption coming, right? And it's not good enough to tell people like, don't worry, there's a relatively high chance you're going to lose a part of your job or your whole job or the part of the job that you like, but it's good overall. Everything will be fine. So I think it's actually hard to generate some optimism around it. Now, if I had a magic wand, what I would do is I would say that the place where the most noticeable massive increase in productivity can come from technology is in the public service and in government. And I would, if I was running a government, I would love a government that said, we're gonna show you how much power there is in doing this. We're gonna try, and we're gonna give you a demonstration case every 6 months about incredible things that we can do. So today it takes you this long to do some basic government service, getting a passport, right? And we're going to cut that time by 90% in the next 6 months, and just throw everything they can at it, and hope that the electoral cycle is enough that you can get through that. That's one way you would get at it, right? And then I think within universities, it's probably the case that for the 4 years that we have kids in our classrooms, we should be as open-minded and broad-minded and ambitious in their use and exploration of technology as possible, right? We're not going to be, by the way, like, don't worry, we're going to spend all our time putting another paragraph in a syllabus to figure out how we constrain the use of ChatGPT as much as possible. But for people who are creative, there are amazing opportunities to probably let kids spend 4 years in exploration, right, around how they could use this to improve their lives. And that's probably where you get the biggest returns.
Ray, do you have a thought about that as well?
I mean, just a kind of a side point on this important question. One of the things that, particularly with respect to government, to furthering the reliable, robust adoption of techniques in government, and deciding how government should be spending its money in this area. Because government is both a consumer and a funder of activity.
And a rule setter.
Yes, that's right. Is getting expertise in government. And the HAI policy guys, the first thing they tell people in government is the thing you really have to focus on is getting people into government who understand this stuff. And that seems to be working. I think somewhere we report actually in there where AI new graduates are going, and the number of them going into government is going up, at least in the U.S. But of course, that's as much of a challenge as with academia, in that they're competing with industry salaries, and it's not easy. So if you go to work for government because you think that government is critical to resolving some of these questions, you're going to take a pay cut. That's just the way it is. But we make those decisions all the time. So
I should also put a plug in for a session this afternoon where we will be looking at AI adoption in industry, and have an opportunity to probe some of the things that Ray and Peter have talked about. We have some questions at the front now. Ron, and then David, and then
I'm curious about public opinion and governmental response with respect to distinguishing between short-term dangers of AI, like getting run over by a self-driving taxi or losing your job this year, and long-term apocalyptic visions, AGI in charge of whatever, going rogue and murdering masses of people, et cetera.
Oh, I think they're worried about both. Would be sort of my sense. What I might say, sort of more with a bit more depth about it, is that I think it's very hard for governments on very short electoral cycles to actually be able to think about those things in the longer term. And when you can't do that, the way you do it is you set up bodies that can think about those things in the longer term. And to Jillian's earlier point about who should be involved in some sense in tech regulation, thinking about the long-term existential threats is something that should be as broad a conversation as possible with as many people involved in it as possible, right? What governments are not good at doing, and this is what they'll have to get good at doing if they want to have widespread use and deployment of AI, especially in public-facing things, is articulating risk and making people understand that government will make mistakes in using technology, but inviting them to bring in risk in using it, right? And if you look at the way government responds to failure with technology, it's exactly the opposite of the way that you would want to deal with it, right? If you're developing technology and deploying it and it fails, the only way you learn, the best way to learn is by as quickly as possible accepting that there's been a failure, trying to get to the bottom of it without casting too much blame, and then innovating from that, right? But if you look at all of the recent kind of massive failures of government technology, in our country we couldn't pay public servants for more than a year because our payroll system, which is a technology system, just failed, right? They ran out of COBOL programmers or something, and they couldn't get onto Phoenix. The United Kingdom is going through a massive scandal about the way its post offices have attributed blame to basically franchisees for fraud, which never occurred, which scandalously ruined lives, and they're going to have a commission to get to the bottom of it. All of that is the opposite of how you learn from failure. So what we need is governments that are going to learn how to actually deploy technology with some risk, and then actually articulate when there's failure and move on from it. And that's going to require a less censorious public. It's going to require people who give government a bit more slack on trying things and failing. I'm not sure we're up to the task, but that's what will be required. To rely on governments, the short answer is to rely on governments to be able to imagine and then regulate against long-term risk for things if you believe governments could do that, we wouldn't have a climate emergency, right? So it can't be left to them.
David, next. 2 mics. Oh, give one to Dan and one to...
Oh, I didn't see.
Dueling mics.
Sorry. Peter, Ray, I'm sorry that I don't have a question for you. Everybody's asking Peter questions. But
he's doing the work. No, he should get the question.
I guess I was once a sociology guy, so I'm interested in surveys. But so obviously what a lot of people have been sort of asking the underlying question of how do you explain these results? And it's not for me to advise you on what to do in your next time around, but I would suggest that it might be worth really trying to dig deeply into trying to understand what is driving these results. And so a couple of hypotheses that I have worth exploring. One of them is, okay, so we see a big difference between the global south and the global north, but is there if you start getting into trying to understand what's driving these different responses, is there homogeneity in those driving forces, even within, say, the global south and the global north? And then, of course, in order to answer that question, you need to be able to have some hypotheses or some lines of research where you're trying to get answers to what is driving them. And one way to do it would be to ask the respondents, why do you think this? You know, what makes you reach this conclusion in response to this question? Another is to look at, you know, as you suggested earlier, exposure to technology in a particular country and what's unique about those exposures to technology. And then more broadly, the social impact of technology, you know, the whole issue of social media, for example, and other socioeconomic determinants, and also government, the role of government, as people have suggested. I mean, China is very bullish on technology. Maybe the respondents there just feel like they need to say that because they're in China and that's the way things work. So that's another sort of layer of inquiry. So I think what you've done is you've done some really interesting research, but it raises more questions than it answers in some respects.
Yeah, usually, right?
I'll take it. Hope it does. I'll take it as a very good set of suggestions. Yeah.
And maybe for others in the audience as well. Can we just pass it to Dan while the mic's there, and then to your left, David? I got to spin my body.
It's kind of unfair to have two sociology questions in a row, but here we go. So, Peter, I was wondering if you guys have played at all with looking for variation within the two groups with other indices like rule of law indices, corruption indices, and things like that. And I'm sort of connecting it back to yesterday's conversations about living and working with AI, which we were talking about, you know, in a very sort of our own egocentric worlds. But if there were a variation within those groups on other things like that that are measured, that we believe we know about, whether you think there would be any interesting things going on there.
Yeah, thanks very much for asking. So there's really two levels at which this will roll out a whole bunch of stuff over the next year, but there's two levels at which to do this, right? One is to go up a level like you've described and actually look for kind of ecological differences, right? And I think there are probably some there, right, that we can uncover. But even, you know, to the point about, you know, measuring things, you know, there is a pretty remarkable paucity of really highly credible cross-country, cross-national measures of engagement with technology, government spending on technology. I mean, OECD produces stuff, but it's actually hard to understand in ways that are comparable to the point earlier about World Bank indices that really help you understand apples to apples how countries differ in terms of use of many of these things. But that going up that ecological level is one, and then going down a level to understanding why you have individual variation within these countries is the other piece, you know. But to the degree that those differences exist in countries, they're largely not compositional. It's not because you've got more rich people in the global north than you do in the global south, or even in the sample. It has to largely do with country level differences that show up in the averaging.
I think the two questions kind of give a shout out to sociologists in the audience that may want to.
Yeah, sociologists need as many shout outs as they can get as a close traveler. Yeah.
There's two hands back there. There's three now, but the one in the black jacket there, on the front of the back first, I think. His hand was up first, and then we'll go to the rose-colored shirt and then back. Thanks.
My question is for Ray. One of the slides that really stuck out to me was the slide on private investment going down from 21 to 22 to 23. I'm surprised because it seems to fly in the face of everything you read in the media around massive new investments in generative AI. It was the year that $10 billion invested in OpenAI by Microsoft, the year that NVIDIA's valuation went through the roof. Where do you see the disconnect? How do you explain how that number is going down, but there seems to be like an arms race in investment? Yeah.
So I'm nowhere near an expert on this, but what seems to be the case is that, as I mentioned, there seem to be a few factors going on at the same time. One is that overall investment, private investment, is going down. And that's not just AI, that's kind of across the board. Big companies, there was this peak at the beginning of the pandemic, and then big companies decided that they needed to trim their budgets, and so they started cutting, and AI got affected along with everything, with everything else. So that's the piece that ties investment to number of jobs, and I can tell that that's happening because I know people who've been caught up in it. So that's one thing. Then there's this countervailing rush towards generative AI, because a lot of that early investment was not generative AI, it was all kinds of other things. And so there's the rush towards generative AI, and you saw how that increases, but that total number is only about a quarter of the total number, so of total private investment. So you have to look at how the pieces fit together, and there's no reason to believe that investment in generative AI isn't going to continue to increase. Listen to Sam Altman, and he tells you he's doing it. But how that's going to fit into whether an insurance company is going to invest more in using generative AI in its relationships with its customers, that I don't know, and it's going to take a while to look at all of this together. But I think the story is consistent. That is, the numbers are consistent. What it's not necessarily consistent with is what you see in the press. But nothing new there.
There was a hand there kind of in the middle, and then we'll come back to this one. And then we're kind of wrapping up.
Thanks for really interesting presentations. One word that I haven't heard much or at all is the word equity. And it's really quite astounding given that we know technologies have differential effects and that the AI revolution is likely to be extremely lucrative for some and quite possibly devastating for others. And so, I'm curious in the reports and your other sense of the discussions going on in AI, where, if anywhere, are discussions of equity happening in terms of the impacts and also how people view AI affecting their lives?
Yeah, I can tell you that in our data, we do ask people about what they think the effects of AI are going to be on inequality in their society, and the same patterns, Patrick, emerge, right? That people are more concerned about the effects of AI on inequality in the Anglo-American world and in Europe than they are in other parts of the world, right? And I'm not sure that the concerns about now inequality and economic inequality are different from obviously related but different in the texture from questions about equity, depending on how we're thinking about it, right? But I do wonder the degree to which that is an animating concern in every part of the world when we think about technology, and I think it's less of a concern in other parts of the world. It's not a moral judgment on that, but I think it's of less concern.
Ray, do you have any insights on that?
No, I don't have anything like that.
There you go.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. This was fascinating, and the global public opinion data was astonishing, the correlation between all the different questions in those clusters of countries. I was interested a bit in some of the notes that were on the last slide, the kind of concluding slide there from Peter. Specifically, the characterization of the optimistic kind of worldview of AI as the realistic one, and the, I think you said realistic and broad-minded. So I was wondering a bit about where that characterization came from, and if there's been any kind of comparisons to other indices to see how people's opinions accord to the reality of the changing situation under, when using AI.
Yeah, no, it comes completely from my own formulation, from my brain. And I happen to think that a view that thinks that my own view is that so it's totally normative claim that the world is going to be one in which there will be widespread economic dislocation. It will be to the benefit of most people. Most people will experience those benefits. There will be as much complementarity as there is substitution in these things, and that if we're embracing of it, the capacity to learn more and do more faster is a good thing. So that's completely a judgment. Thank you for catching it. That I think that the part of the world that's enthusiastic about technology is more realistic than the part of the world that thinks it's all doom and gloom. But it's just merely a judgment from my brain to all of you.
And that's a great way to conclude, I think.
Is it?
From all of our brains to all of you, thank you so much.